All right, I want to start by telling you a story, and the reason for the story might not make sense at first, but I will get to the part where it makes sense. So this guy's name is Jacob Bromwell. He was born in 1785, so a long time ago in Virginia, old school American. So he was born, what's that, 9 years after the Revolution, thereabouts. So I mean, this is old school, old-fashioned American guy. Now he looks pretty grumpy in this picture, right? Really, he was a nice guy. Everyone just looked grumpy in pictures back then because he had to sit still for so long. So really, this was a totally nice, amiable guy. Everyone knew him. He was fond of family and friends, and he would have people over to his house all the time. So he was known for being a really good guy. So don't let the grumpy picture fool you. So to give you an idea, this is what America looked like at the time. So it was a couple of colonies, a couple of territories. This is Spain down here. So this is back in the old days. And he came from an entrepreneurial family. So his father did what's called wire weaving. So they basically made cool things out of wire. They would mesh materials together. They would make things like this bench. And that was their business, and that was the family business. Made things out of wire and little bits of metal and whatever he could. So that's kind of the craft he learned as he's out there on sort of the American frontier trying to figure out what this whole new nation is going to be. So he got into the family business and kind of progressed through that and was doing lots of cool stuff there. Time passes, he kind of learns the family business. He gets around to 1812, which a lot of people aren't very familiar with the War of 1812, but there was a big old war back then. It was basically the continuation of the Revolutionary War. It was basically us finishing some things out with the British. There were some unresolved issues, and we just went ahead and resolved them. But this was a big old war, so he got recruited into that. And at the time, he's a young man, so I mean, not from that grumpy picture, but picture him being one of these, strapping young men in a spiffy uniform. So cool, super cool, all-American guy defending his country. And War of 1812 was pretty gnarly. I mean, there's the White House burned from the inside out. So this was a big old war. So these are the kinds of things he's going through. He's born right after independence. Entrepreneur in this kind of new nation. He's battling to defend the country against the British. And so that's kind of the mentality he comes up with. So he's progressing through, and he gets older and he finally sets out on his own. So this was what, 1819? He sets out on the Ohio River and he takes these wire looms, which are these big tools for weaving wire, puts some of them on a boat. This is a flat boat riding down the Ohio River and goes to Cincinnati. So he's going out west, which Cincinnati at the time was out west. And he decides he's going to go out on his own, set up his own business, doing kind of this metalworking and stuff. So the year he starts, the Panic of 1819, which is sort of equivalent to, worse than the recession we're going through now, is basically the biggest peacetime financial crisis in U.S. history by that point. There wasn't that much U.S. history, but it was this was their first big, what the heck, massive unemployment, massive bankruptcies, everything going horribly wrong. That's the year he sets out on his own and goes into business. And he manages to do pretty well for himself. So he says, this is a pretty cool building. I wish I had an office like that. So he's doing well. He's growing the business, and he starts branching out what he's doing and starts getting into other kinds of metalworking. So they do flour sifters, and he starts getting into more housewares, cups, cheese graters. I assume at the time they sold them, they weren't quite as rusty as this. So he's inventing all these products. He's designing for the needs of this frontier city and figuring out what they need and how to solve those needs. And he develops a heck of a business doing it. I mean, as the business progresses, their catalog has thousands of products that they've designed. They have over 1,000 employees, and this is back in the tough old days. So this grumpy looking old dude is actually this is a great American story. Designer, entrepreneur, frontiersman. Like good old fashioned American guy back when America was cool. And that's a great story to tell. But has anyone heard of this guy before? Probably not. So this is just one example of a great story that was just sort of lost in time. Now, 190 years later, the business is still around. So this is one of the oldest still operational businesses in the United States. And they came to us, and by the time they came to us, it had basically devolved into a template Yahoo store. So this is sort of like the bottom end of e-commerce. That's about as low as you can get, is when you've got a Yahoo store. And that's what this empire of handcrafted American design, tradition, all this stuff had sort of devolved into that. And they basically came to us and said, well, we need a nicer website. And we spent months going back and forth with him trying to say, it's not, you don't have an aesthetics problem. It's not the niceness of the website that's the problem. You have a relevance problem. Nobody cares. You're selling the same products, actually made on a lot of the same machines that they were back then. Great stories there, great traditions there, great, there's like a lot of stuff to get excited about. And none of that's really happening here. It's just a template Yahoo store. So there's nothing for people to get excited about. That was their problem. So when they first came to us, they weren't quite thinking that way. So that was something we had to get them there. And it took actually months of coaching and long emails. Some of the longest emails I've ever written, just like, here's everything I know about why this is important to you. And so finally they got it, and they decided, all right, let's go ahead and do this. We're going to trust you guys. We'll take a shot at this. And so we start walking through this process. And this is where we start getting into the deep design and the difference between deep design and just sort of superficial aesthetic design. Because a lot of design firms would have taken that and said, oh yeah, we can make a prettier website for you. Polish something up, get something out there, some nice colors, follow some trends, put cool logo on it, throw it out there, and you're done. But we didn't think that would work, so we wanted to go deeper. So what we do is we start with personas. How many of you guys here as part of your work do personas? I'm sure there's a decent number. So personas are basically a fictional representation of your target audience, so you can get specific. So instead of saying, well, we're selling to people in this region, between these ages, between this and this, and just having random demographics, we start getting into, what are their psychographics? How do they think? What kinds of people are they? And give them a name and a face so that we can actually connect with them. So when we're designing something, it's not in a vacuum. We say, is this going to work for Anne? And we actually ask ourselves those questions and walk through that process to make sure that we're designing not for some random demographic, but for Anne. And we can ask ourselves, would that work? And our brains can process that better, and we can work with that information and come up with more relevant solutions. And then we start working on a brand metaphor. And a metaphor is just something that kind of helps anchor the concept and helps us figure out what we're doing. And the metaphor for this one was fairly straightforward because fortunately there was this cool guy doing all this cool stuff, and we basically based it around him. And we're going with this inventive pioneer concept. I mean, this guy was a frontier entrepreneur designer. Let's go with that and kind of tie some of those things and bring that out in the brand. We do a lot of competitive research, so we analyze a lot of similar historical brands, and we looked at the trajectories that they had taken and what had worked for them and what hadn't. And not necessarily to imitate, but to figure out what's a more open area of the market that we can go after. So that's how we, and this is what keeping in the character with the current owners of the company. They were young, lighthearted. They didn't mind mixing it up a little bit. So instead of trying to go serious, traditional, somber, kind of old school that way, we brought it back and went more to the lighthearted side. And so that helped us carve out a more unique character for them. Then we started going through and looking at actual documentation from that time frame, things that he would, Jacob Bromwell himself would have seen and experienced, of what that time would have been like, so that we can pull visual ideas from that and bring them forward. So things like typography. Now, a lot of you will recognize these are not all authentic fonts from that time period. Some of them are, but a lot of these are just ones that help evoke that, but are maybe also available as web fonts and things like that. And we start pulling out visual elements too and extrapolating from the brand and the concept that we're creating and saying, what would this look like? What kinds of textures would be appropriate? What kinds of colors would be appropriate? What kinds of treatments would be appropriate? And pulling all that stuff together so that we can create a more authentic experience around what they're doing. And that applies to the verbal side of things as well. So, this verbal copywriting is just a different kind of design. A lot of designers don't necessarily think of it that way. We think of content. Content is the words you put in our cool design, as like you're filling a bucket with something. And that's not really how it works. The words are design also. They have a very dramatic effect on how you perceive things. The words I say right now are totally going to shape how you take the message that I'm giving you. So you're not basing it all on the clothes that I'm wearing or what the slides look like. So those words have a big difference. You can change one word, totally change someone's perception. So we go through a lot of work to make sure we're designing on the verbal side as well. And we take that kind of information and a lot of other stuff and we put it together into what we call a brand handbook. And it's a little different than a style guide. A lot of companies put together style guides, which are basically rule books. You should use the logo like this. You won't use these colors. You won't put it like this. You won't put it too close to that. And half the time nobody listens to those things anyway. I mean, you probably heard yesterday we were talking about Whole Foods. Like they basically realized they weren't really following it, so they threw it out. we try just never to start with those. We usually don't put together those rule books, and instead we put together these kind of documents to say, this is who you're designing for. This is kind of the direction you're designing. This is what it feels like. Because people can click with that and follow that a lot more accurately than a set of rules. So instead of being rule-based, we try very much more of a coaching approach that says, this is the kind of direction you're trying to go. And then based on that, that's how we get from a brand which exists like this and start to give it a look that's more like this, that's more authentic to what the company really is, the heritage that they really have, the things that they're trying to accomplish, and what they want to convey. And this fit them a lot better. We executed that on the website, and so you can see the difference between the Yahoo store and this. This you can come to, but you get to it and you have some idea what this is about. You can within milliseconds get what's going on here and make the decision if you want to be a part of that or not. You might say, oh, that's so not me, I'm out of here. But you couldn't necessarily do that on a Yahoo store. On a Yahoo store, you had to click around and kind of look at the products and figure it out. Here you know right away. You know if it's you or if it's not you. And they had great results as a part of this. I mean, we had good feedback. We actually had Seth Godin say what a beautiful site it was. That was kind of cool. There's a blog post that we saw one of the customers had purchased something. So this is a tin toaster. And so this guy was writing about how they were living in a small place. They basically didn't have room for a toaster on their counter. So they were looking for some alternative solution because they really like toast. So they got this. They finally found this through Jacob Bromwell. And you essentially set this on your stove. And then you can toast using your stove. You don't need a whole toaster to do it. And in this blog post, there were some great comments that I really appreciated. This good feedback that what we're doing is actually working. So they said things like, I don't know about you, but owning a piece of flimsy tin isn't very inspiring. Owning a precious piece of American history, now that's pretty cool. And some of this was because of the packaging that came with it, the copywriting that came with it. There was little cards, little booklets that came with it, and basically told them, this is what you're really getting. It's not 20 cents worth of tin. You're getting this heritage and this story that's coming along with it. And this was my favorite part. It wasn't just a marketing or branding gimmick. It was authentic. This really was who they were. We weren't just throwing a bit of old-fashionedness on a brand that had no claim to that. We were trying to really represent what they felt their heritage was, what they believed in, and who they were as a company. And it actually worked out pretty well. So I had lunch with the owner a couple years after we did it, and he said that year they were on track to make 5 times the revenue they had when they first came to us, and he attributed that largely to the experience we'd created around the brand. Now, your mileage may vary. Not every client's going to have a 5x revenue increase. It would be great if they did, but this stuff works, and they saw that connection between the two. They said this never would have happened had we not gone through that process. And that really comes to the point of deep design, which is that design isn't pretty making, design is problem solving. And as I said before, Bromwell didn't have an aesthetics problem. Now, it wasn't the prettiest site, but that wasn't their fundamental problem. Their fundamental problem was a relevance problem. Nobody knew why they should care. And what we did is we tried to solve that bigger problem of why should anyone care about this company? And when they came to us, they really didn't know much about this Jacob Bromwell guy. They knew his name, and they knew when he was born, and they knew he founded the company. So we did all the genealogical research. We found his signature, which is now the logo for the company. We did all that stuff to bring it out and figure out what that authentic story was. The reason that this is important is that people don't really buy the marketing stuff anymore. I mean, you can throw a pretty facade on pretty much anything, but you guys all know when someone has just thrown a pretty facade on something, right? Like, you can tell. Well, so can everyone else. So that's not a viable solution anymore. We are bombarded with messages telling us, plenty of pretty, attractive messages telling us to buy things, and it's not working really anymore. I mean, it does a little bit, but you guys know the difference. You know when something is a piece of crap that's packaged well, and you know how to sort that out. And the fact that you're all interconnected now helps that message spread even faster than it ever has. So, the old way of just throw a pretty layer on something and ship it out there just doesn't work anymore as a design solution. Customers have great BS detectors. They know when you're making something up. Consumers are generally skeptical now, and you have to sort of convince them that this is an authentic experience, and they will pick up on the subtle clues to tell them that. We make split-second decisions to decide is something authentic or not, and we do that based on tone of voice, imagery, context, timing, pacing, storytelling, all those things all accumulate in our minds and we make a decision that says, is this what it says it is, or is this a bunch of BS? And we're actually pretty accurate at making those decisions. But companies still try and be that guy and basically just say, oh, I see you like this. Well, yeah, we're totally about that. Or, oh, you want this? We can do that too. What do you want to do right now? And at a party, nobody really likes that guy who just wants to do whatever you want to do, just wants to talk about whatever you want to talk about. The people we like are the ones that kind of know who they are, and they know what they want to talk about. They know what they want to do, and that's what we're attracted to, not pandering and conceding everything and just sort of being whatever someone else wants. We don't want all the massive customization. We don't want every company to bend to our will. Sometimes we just want a company to stand for something, and we can decide if we want to be a part of it or not. But this isn't really just about marketing either. So we've talked a lot about marketing and branding, but it's not just about that. Deep design and the principle of going deeper and beyond the superficial layer applies to things like UX as well. So this isn't UX, user experience design. I know a lot of people who their job is basically sketch stuff out, and they call themselves a user experience designer. And client asks them for something, they sketch it out and give it back and say, okay, your user experience is done. That's not really how you do that. I mean, the user was never involved in that process at all. So this is really what UX design is. It's a process of going through and understanding who the user is, what the context of the user is, what are the things that they're dealing with, and gaining insights about them, and specifically extracting insights from the research that you've done. Then you take those insights, turn that into a concept. You turn a concept into actual executed design. And then, of course, it iterates. You kind of go in this cycle. That's user experience design. Sketching iPad apps in itself is not user experience design. In some way, you're designing something that's ultimately going to get used by a user, but they were never part of that experience. You weren't really taking the time to think through that. And to do that, I mean, you really should have some process behind it. Get it out of your own head. Sometimes your instincts will get you some of the way, but it's really worth getting it out of your head and thinking through it in an intentional, specific way so that you can work that stuff out. And really, all that stuff boils down to empathy. It's empathy for the user, empathy for the customer. It's figuring out who is it that you're designing for. We talked about Anne earlier. That was one of our sample personas for that project. How do we have empathy for her and design for her, not me and what I think I want to design based on what the current trends are and what I saw on some design inspiration site the other day and some cool thing I saw on Pinterest, and I'm just going to tie it all together and call it good. How do I get out of my own head and design for someone else? And empathy, this is the most fundamental principle in all of design. All of design is based around empathy. And so that's really the heart of the user experience design project, or designing any experience for customers. And really that starts with anthropology, which is doing the research to figure out who you're doing this for. When we did that one for Bromwell, for example, we did surveys. We actually asked a lot of questions. We also know enough to not take the answers to those questions always literally, because sometimes people don't know how to self-report well on things, but we can read between the lines and figure out what are the underlying patterns and trends. We also actually observe behavior. So we look at the analytics for their website and see, well, this is popular and this is less popular. And then we have to extrapolate, well, maybe this is less popular just because it's positioned on the wrong place on the website. There's a lot of kind of interpretation that has to be done. But we essentially do the anthropology before we start designing something. We don't jump right into sketching and, I've got this great idea and I saw this thing the other day and doing that. Do the anthropology, figure out what you're doing and what the context is, and then actually move forward and figure out how to execute on that. And don't assume you know what the customer wants. It's really easy for us to say, well, I'm kind of like that person. I can picture in my head what, how they're going to think and how they're going to respond to something. We're actually terrible at it. For one thing, we're designers, which is already a strike against us because we think differently than most people do. Our brains function in a different way, and we'll actually talk about that in a minute. But we're not normal people, and we shouldn't think that we can just step over here and, oh, now I'm in this person's shoes. It takes work to do that, and it's worth going through the work because you get at answers that you wouldn't otherwise get at. Mark Twain said, supposing is good, but finding out is better. And that's basically the principle behind doing that kind of research. And it doesn't always have to be extensive. It's scary sometimes to say, well, there's just no budget for user research. Sometimes the user research can be a little bit, but a little bit is way better than nothing. And the reason all this is important is that the users are human beings. Customers are human beings. And it is, human beings are deeply complicated, volatile, intricate, carefully calculating and then sometimes randomly emoting beings. It's not as simple as, oh, this person is a teenager and teenagers always like this, so we're going to make it like this. Which is why we have every cheesy public service announcement directed at teenagers ever that has never actually resonated with teenagers, because nobody's really putting themselves in their shoes. They're making assumptions, and those assumptions can be actually toxic to the design process. So be careful that you acknowledge the complexity and variability of the audience that you're designing for, because you need to account for that and go through that thought process and kind of work that out to even get close to a good answer. And as we were saying earlier, I mean, it's really frustrating to try and pitch that to a client because they want everything now. They don't want to pay much for it. And most of the people in this room are probably panicking, saying, well, I don't have budget for user research, and my client or my boss is not going to let us have time to do that, or we don't. It's hard. But if you think about doctors, a doctor doesn't complain that they can't diagnose people because they have so much prescription writing to do. You guys as designers are writing prescriptions. Make sure you've done the diagnosis first. Diagnose, then prescribe. Don't get that out of order. So I want to talk a little bit about just sort of what the goals of design are anyway. And this is, as we're talking about deep design, this is how we get deeper into design. So, the first layer is obviously functionality. And that's kind of a user experience oriented word, but in print design or anything, it just does the thing do what it's supposed to do. If you're designing a gig poster for a band, does it have the date? Does it have the venue? Does it have the core functions that it needs to do? On top of that, there's intuitiveness. That's sort of the next layer that you need to accomplish, is how do you make it so that people can understand what you've put on there and it's not a cryptic, opaque thing that's tough to get through. And then we're starting to get deeper and deeper into the design process. Then you get into efficiency. If you've designed a web application, it may be functional and it may even be intuitive, but if it takes me 17 intuitive clicks to get to something, I'm still going to be frustrated. So how can you make it efficient and help people get through that process? And now we're starting to get into the deeper stuff. So we're getting into ideas like comfort. If you're about to push a button and you're designing a web application, you're about to push a button, and you're not quite sure if that's going to ruin everything when you push that button. Does this delete my account, or does this take me to the screen where I can think about deleting my account? Stuff like that. You can give a lot of comfort to the user by thinking through, putting yourself in their shoes and saying, what, I bet they're worried about this right here. Let me just put in a line of copy that says, like you see this when you're doing e-commerce checkouts. Your order will not be placed when you hit this button. And you can get to the next screen and then you can make your final decision. Those kind of things are all about comfort. That's a much deeper level of design that you can get to. And then finally, there's delight, and that's really that's the pinnacle that we're trying to get to. You haven't done your job totally, but just because you have functional, intuitive stuff, a lot of people would see those as the ideals. Those are just the table stakes. Like at the very least, it needs to be functional and intuitive. It's when you start pushing through and getting deeper into the design process that you start to get at things like comfort and delight. That's where the really rich, high quality, really effective stuff starts to come out. So a couple weeks ago, I did a 2-week UX boot camp for a company in Atlanta. It's a software company, and they were sort of going through this struggle of they had historically had Windows software, and they were trying to convert their software over to a web interface. Most of their software looked like this. So that's not the actual screen. This thing's wrapped up under NDA, so I can't say too much about it. But that's the screen I found that looks similar to this one that we worked on. But this would have been sketched out by a product manager. The product manager is someone who's maybe a former client or someone who'd worked in that industry before, and they kind of know, well, when someone does this, they need to do that, so we need a button that lets them do that. But they weren't necessarily from a design background. Almost nobody in the company was from a design background. So I was kind of teaching UX from scratch, and I had 2 weeks to just take them through the whole process. And we actually got pretty far through it, which was nice. But toward the end, one of the things they wanted to have me do is actually redesign some of the screen. And so they showed me a screen like this that they'd been particularly struggling with. And this is one of the next ones that their team was going to start working on. And it was for a context where it's in a warehouse, and there's a computer terminal, and there's a guy standing over here with an RF scanner, and he'll scan a box, and then he walks back over here and checks to make sure the number's right. He walks back over here, scans another box. He walks back over here to make sure the number's right. And functionally, it did it. It did what it was supposed to do. It would read the input from the scanner, and it would put the number there, and they could check it. But that's not a great process, is it? Like you guys can tell that there's some efficiencies that can be gained there. And so, from this dialog box, it looks something like this. I started asking them a lot of questions. I was like, well, who works in these warehouses? What kind of people work in these warehouses? What is it like? What's the chain of command in this warehouse? They had never taken the time to think through what the user was experiencing because they were wrapped up in the fact that, well, I sketch these things out, and then the developers just put them in a standard WinForms interface, and that's how we do. And really, at no point in the process did someone say, how does the user feel about this? Because some poor guy in a warehouse is annoyed because he spends all day walking back and forth and doing this. And that guy's tired at the end of the day. He's probably mad when he gets home, and he's yelling at his wife, and all these things are happening because they designed this like that. So, at this point, these guys are getting annoyed. Like I'm like digging into these, the psyche of this guy working into the warehouse. They're like, can you go design some stuff for us? And they didn't realize what the point of all that was until I got back and I showed them that, which was you scan it. I had to blur it out because it's under NDA. But you scan it, and it shows it in the last 4 digits in really big print. And so I can say, scan, oh, yeah, same number. Scan, oh, yeah, same number. I've made that guy's life hugely easier through a very rudimentary design change. There was nothing revolutionary that had to happen there. And that was the extent of the user research that I performed. I asked them questions, not even of the user, just of people who understood the user, asked them questions, thought about it, came up with some insights, and designed a solution around that. It doesn't have to be a whole lot more extensive than that. It's helpful if you can do user studies and things like that. But if you just have as a fundamental part of your process to just think through it for a minute, it will help massively, and you will come up with conclusions you wouldn't otherwise have come up with. So convergent thinking is how probably 95% of decision making is handled, which is, you have an option, and there's probably another option, and you make a decision, and you come up with an answer. You do some sort of cost-benefit analysis. Well, I could do this, but then I have to do this, or I could do this, but then it's going to cost me this much, so I'm going to go with this one. And that's decision making. 95% probably of management decisions made in companies these days are all that kind of thinking. You have 2 obvious choices, and you pick one of them. So there's another kind of thinking, though, that designers are more prone to, and this is part of why we have warped brains and we're not always good stand-ins for customers. So we, as designers, we tend to think more along the lines of divergent thinking, which is, we do some of that research and reflection and think about the situation for a minute, and then we actually branch out and we start coming up with new options. We start figuring out what are the other options in there, and they may not even look like A and B. They may be completely off the wall things that wouldn't even have occurred to anyone. But if you do the work, if you sit and think about it for a minute, you do a little bit of research, you gain some insights, and you start extrapolating from those insights, well, you say, well, we could do this, and that option may never have been on the table before. So designers have the ability to get new options onto the table. And then really the core of design thinking is combining those 2 things together. How do you get those new options onto the table and have some logical process for then making a decision based on those so that you come up with option M where previously they only ever would have come up with option B. So when you go through this kind of thinking process, this is really what the heart of design is. And this is when you start getting into the deeper answers, when you think about things and reflect on them and come up with new ways of doing things. Anyone know who this is? Henry Ford. So he is the he has a great quote that's the quintessential example of this. He said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. He didn't give them a faster horse. He built the car. He gave them a solution that they didn't even know that they needed. And that's really, that's sort of the heart of what design is about. Your clients aren't hiring you to pick one of their options and then execute it. Some of them are. I'm sorry for you guys, but some of your clients are doing that. But really, they're hiring you because they know that you can come up, or hopefully they know, or you hope they know, that you can come up with a different answer than they would. So when they say, oh yeah, I want a 50s sci-fi theme, you are able to think through all the options and say, maybe you don't. Maybe there's this other way we can do things. Maybe there's this way we can carve out this unique voice for you and do something different with it. And really, that's what designers do. I mean, we take all these different inputs and different sources of inspiration, different ways of thinking about the world, and we put things together in different ways. We juxtapose ideas together, and we come up with some amazing solutions as a result of that. That's what your clients are paying you for. They don't always know that. They should know that. But that's ideally why you hire a designer, because they can come up with the better answer for something. Now the question, of course, is how do you get clients to appreciate that fact? How do you get them to pay for that? How do you get them to understand the fact that that process actually takes a little bit longer than just knocking something out in Photoshop? And a lot of it just comes to the way that you talk about yourself, the way that you talk about what you do, the way you talk about your profession, the way you carry yourself, hopefully not talking like this, which is how designers talk about themselves. You know, we talk about ourselves as pretty makers. We are not pretty makers. We are problem solvers. We execute that visually, but we can also execute that in language. We can execute that in interactions. There are lots of different ways we can execute it. But please, for the love of all that's holy, stop talking like this. Like, this is what drives the profession down, because what clients think when they're hiring a designer is this. I got to get someone to push some pixels around for me. That's not what you were put on this earth to do, is push pixels around. Don't call yourself a pixel pusher. Talk about design. Understand what your profession is. Learn to talk about it that way. Learn to make the case for it. Learn, why that provides value to them. And learn to talk about it that way and to show that value for it. That's how you convince clients to let you do that. There's a friend of mine, a past client of ours, Brian Collick. He works for Twitter now. But he said, I'm a designer like the guy who created the highway system, not the guy who painted the stripes on it. So don't be a stripe painter. Design the system, not just decorate it. Now, it's tempting in our jobs to design sort of by haphazard inspiration. And this is actually, I know a lot of designers who this is kind of their process. They get a project, they talk to the client for a little bit, and then they hop on the design inspiration sites. And they go, oh, that's kind of cool, and that's kind of cool, and that's kind of cool, and I'll just kind of like weave that together. That's not really an effective way to get at those solutions. Design inspiration sites aren't bad. I mean, they can knock some ideas loose. But really, this process is your inspiration machine. This is where the ideas will come from, and it's a methodical process. You don't have to sit and wait for inspiration to strike. You don't ever have to sit there and go, I don't know what I'm going to do with this client. I don't know what direction I want to take this. If you go through this process, the process will tell you what direction you want to go. It will become self-evident. And when you wind up there at the design stage, you can trace it all the way back. When the client says, why did you choose that font? You can trace it all the way back to the beginning. And you can say, we did this research, we got this insight, we came up with this concept, and now here we are, and here's the design, and they know. You don't have to design 3 totally different comps and have them choose the one that they want. That's ridiculous. When you do this process, you really only have to go one direction. You don't backtrack and go all over the place. Generally speaking, you just go in a straight line, and when you're over here, you have a reason for every step of the way that happened, and you can explain that reason to the client, and it becomes harder, at least, for them to just whimsically change their mind and say, you know what, I kind of want it purple now. You can explain to them why purple is wrong, why it's actually not the right answer. Not because you don't like it, not because you're saying, well, I'm the designer, trust me, because that's always the wrong answer. But you walk them through and you say, listen, you told me over here this. Because of that, this, because of that, this, because of that, this, because of that, it's totally orange. And as you learn to do that, they will start to see the logic in that, and it'll make a lot more sense. And the problem is that if you don't have those roots, if you don't have that foundation, no matter how pretty you make it, it can always just topple over. You can be the most amazing aesthetic designer. You can come up with glorious looking, super pretty things. But if it doesn't have that foundation to it, it can always fall over. The client can just say, well, I changed my mind, I want it to look like this. And you have no recourse. When you have explanation and depth to what you do, you have that recourse. You have a justification for what you did. You have an explanation. There's a reason you got to where you got. So that kind of design kind of reminds me of this phrase. I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it. That's kind of what that superficial level of design is like. Where when you have a solid foundation, when you have roots, amazing things happen. This tree is not going anywhere, and it looks awesome. That's how your design should be. And a lot of it just comes down to knowing why. Knowing the reason behind the things that you've done. Knowing why you made a certain choice. Any font you choose. How you punctuate a sentence. What exact color you choose. What background pattern you use. Even getting into the development side. What CSS framework are you using? All those things should have logical reasons behind them. You should always be able to answer the question why. When a client says, why'd you do this? You have an answer. And that answer is not because I'm the designer and I know best. It's not because I like that best. It's not because that's what's popular right now. It's because it is right for you as the client in the situation that you're in with the people you're trying to communicate with. That is the right answer. And here's why. Let me show you. And then you explain it. So when you know why you're doing things, you get at that deeper level of design that really resonates with clients. And we kind of talked about this earlier, but just saying what do you think about this is the wrong way to present it. I mean, you have to sell this to your client. You have to explain the logic. You have to show your work. I mean, if your doctor showed you X-rays and said, "Well, what do you think?" How would you feel? Well, that's how your clients feel when you send them a comp and say, "Well, tell me how you like it." That's not your job. Your job is to tell them what's wrong, solve their problem, give them the solution, explain it in detail, tell them what their options are, and help them move forward. Treat it like you're a doctor, not a pretty maker. You're not a pretty maker. You're a designer. And a lot of that comes down to showing your work. I mean, we kind of walked you through that process of what we did. I've got another example I want to show you, but this is kind of how we treat it. We're in the middle of that formula that says, then a miracle occurs. That's how we talk about design too much of the time. How'd you come to this answer? Well, because I'm a great designer. That's, show the work, show how you got there, and then they will understand it. Take them on that journey with you. So this is another project we have. This is an organization, it's a supply chain research center. Not the sexiest thing in the world, but this was a cool project. And we love stuff like this. We love the boring, weird, like obscure, difficult stuff. Most people don't even know what supply chain is, but even their target audience that doesn't really get the depth of knowledge and stuff that we have. And if you guys don't know what supply chain is, it's basically what makes something from over there get over here, and the whole world operates it on it. Supply chain is what will solve world hunger. It is what gets you your package from Amazon the next day. It's what makes stuff move around the world. So the whole world is wildly dependent on supply chain, and this is a source for research that makes supply chain move faster. The world works because of organizations like this. Nobody's ever heard of this place except for C-level executives at Fortune 500 companies, but that's the kind of stuff they're doing. So we had to figure out how do we communicate that value, how do we get those points across. So we do the personas again. We go through and we figure out who are these people. That was a tough crowd to research. We actually did phone interviews with C-suite officers. Those are hard people to get a hold of, but we did. We did about 15 of them. And because of that, we actually really started to understand where they were coming from and what they needed. And then based on that, we started, we developed the metaphors that kind of fit with that. In this particular case, we used archetypes. So we usually use two of them, and we combine them together to get some flavor. So we had the intellectual and the explorer. And for each one, we kind of pulled some visuals that helped us, give us a direction for how we might present those things. And then based on those two, we can kind of merge them together. And that gives us sort of a visual language we can start using. And by the way, if anyone is curious about the archetypes, you can go to our website. If you Google brand archetypes, you'll get to our website. And we have a download where you can go through all those. We have a lot of cool stuff for that. So we start creating this visual language, pulling from those sources of inspiration. Now, this is an organization that doesn't have 190 years of history, but we can still do deep design for an organization that doesn't have that kind of history. We started designing logos. Those logos aren't based on what was pretty or, hey, maybe we can get the P and the S and we can combine them together. It wasn't just random stuff like that. It was like these are based on the archetypes that we developed. There are specific, underlying, almost subconscious reasoning for why we went those directions. And of course, we do the verbal strategy behind it as well. We talk about, how are you going to talk about yourselves to get those points across? Design is really about intention. It's about doing things intentionally, not randomly, not haphazardly. The word design itself means planning and intentionality and strategy and having a reason for doing something. I mean, the word design, he had designs to do something. He had a plan to do something. It doesn't mean pretty, ever. It can also be pretty, but design is not about pretty. Design is about solving the problem. And that's how we're able to take something like this and turn it into something like this. Now, again, this is probably not going to win any awards. If we wanted to win awards, we need like a Flash-based site about breast cancer awareness from Hyundai with a voiceover by Liam Neeson. So, this isn't that. This is like bread and butter kind of stuff. But for these guys, this totally works. Their audience gets it now. They are selling more now. They're reaching out. They're connecting to people in ways that they didn't. Even their own staff is now excited and gets what's going on in this company. They get who they are, and they are themselves excited about it. So this is totally working for them. And that's really what we do. I mean, as a company, our job is to go into these situations and figure out what is that deeper story that's underlying it. How do we pull that out in an intentional way and design this deeper experience around it? So one last thought that I want to make is, yesterday one of the speakers, I couldn't remember who, basically said, listen, just chill out. Design's not going to save the world, right? We're doing some stuff, it's cool, but you're not going to save the world. I would argue that design might be the only thing that will actually save the world. And the reason is this design thinking process that we go through. The way that we think, now I'm not talking just about graphic designers, I'm talking about design generally. There are a lot of people who design who aren't called designers. But the people who design, the people who think like designers, are the ones who come up with new options when the old options aren't good enough. So this process that everyone in this room is prone to doing, this is your natural instinct, this is how you're in this profession. This process is about the only thing that actually will save the world. We need new options, we need new ways of doing things. Now you may do that in little ways, but if we do something with supply chain that enables stuff to move faster from here to here, someone's going to benefit as a result of that, and that benefit carries on and ripples into other things. So keep doing that, because that's what designers do. That's what you guys are predisposed to do. We need more people in the world who are predisposed to do that. So have respect for your profession, have respect for what you do, acknowledge what you guys are as designers, learn how to talk to your clients about that, not being pretty makers, and take advantage of that and enjoy the privilege of being a designer in the world. So that's it for me. Thank you.